Hi guys, and welcome to the second part of your Easter homework. So we're now moving away from the general symptoms of the disorders. So we looked at the symptoms of OCD, depression and phobias, and we've attempted to categorise them as behavioural, emotional or cognitive symptoms. The second bit, which is the biggest bit of the homework, is looking at different ways in which we can go about defining abnormality. Now, over the course of this homework, you're going to be looking at 4 different definitions of abnormality. If you look at your contents page, they are as follows. Deviation from social norms, failure to function adequately, deviation from ideal mental health, and statistical infrequency. So we will be working our way through all 4, however you'll see that it's divided up into different chunks. Within this first video, I describe and evaluate 2 definitions. I do social norms and failure to function. Then the rest of the videos follow on from that. So take your time with it. Do 1, consolidate your knowledge, fill in the essay plan, fill in the big A3 summary sheet. It's about you taking your time and just making sure you understand it before moving on to the next one. So, as I've already mentioned, you are going to look at 4 different definitions of abnormality. Now, the typical exam question for this area would be identify and outline 1 definition of abnormality, and it would typically be worth 4 marks. Identify simply means to name a definition, and then you get 3 marks of credit for outlining 1 definition. Now, that question would pretty much always stay the same. It will always be worth 4 marks. The only time it would ever change is if they've already named a definition for you or they've already given you some examples of behaviours. But for most cases, it will be worth 4 marks. So we have learned over the years that if that question comes up, there is a very, very easy structure that you can follow to ensure that you get all 4 marks of credit. So every definition that I outline here will follow this 4-part structure. And if you learn it and stick to it, you will always pick up those marks. So section number 1, which I'll make reference to all the way through, is to name the definition. But you've got to do that word for word as we tell you it. If you just make it up as you feel is okay to express it, then it won't get credit because it won't match the syllabus. So it's got to be word for word as we tell you it. Part number 2 is just a general description saying how that definition goes about categorising abnormal people and or behaviour. Now at that stage, part number 2, is very, very general. In part number 3, however, it becomes a little bit more difficult. That's where we would expect you to elaborate. So we might see some terminology, we might see some examples, or with a couple of the disorders, we're going to see some categories of behaviour, specific categories that abnormal people will demonstrate or fail to demonstrate. And then on to section number 4 is the application section. It is the hardest bit to get, and it's the one mark which people tend to drop. You've got to be able to apply the ideas that you've referenced in parts 2 and 3 and apply them to a specific disorder, and it's got to be one of the 3 that we're learning about, so OCD, depression or phobias. Now you'll see that you've been given a big A3 summary sheet that has got space for 4 different definitions, and each of those definitions is broken down into this structure. Every time we complete one of those definitions, it would be a very, very good idea then for you to fill in the 4 boxes, all right, so you've got that definition outlined. So that's just a little bit about exam structure before we go on. So now then, we are going to move into our first definition. So you need to be on page 4. Section number 1, I already said to you, is naming the definition. So this first definition is known as deviation from social norms. You're not allowed to say, therefore, breaking social norms or not following social norms. It's got to be that terminology. So deviation from social norms categorizes abnormal behaviour as follows. So this is section number 2. Behaviour is abnormal, according to this definition, if it goes against what society considers the norm. So at that stage, if you just write that in your exam, you have already got 2 marks. So deviation from social norms, behaviour is abnormal if it goes against what society considers the norm. So all that's pretty straightforward. What you'll see on the next slide, however, is that we're going to start elaborating. So section number 3 is the elaboration, where we use terminology and examples. So according to deviation from social norms, abnormality is behaviour that breaks society's rules about acceptable conduct. Now, these are often what we would call the unwritten rules of society that we learn simply by growing up within that society. So that's all we need to say at the moment, that abnormality is behaviour that breaks rules put in place by a society, and these are normally those unwritten rules. They are not laws, they are just simply the social norms that we all adhere to. Now, in this section, part number 3, where you're elaborating, you should also give a couple of examples. So here you can see that I've given you a couple of examples of said social norms. Things that are not rules by any stretch of the imagination, but they are, not laws, but they are these unwritten rules, these unspoken guidelines that we all kind of like fit or stick to. So wearing clothes in public, eating with a knife or a fork, saying please and thank you, knowing that we should cry at a funeral. Nobody tells you to do these things, it's just kind of like expected. So that's the little bit about social norms, and that would get you your 3rd mark, okay? Telling me what a social norm is and providing me with an example. Now, if we move it on to section number 4, which I said is the most important bit, you've got to be able to apply. Now, for this particular definition of abnormality, you have got to give an example of an abnormal behaviour which someone with a mental illness, OCD, depression or phobias, would perform, and then state what the equivalent social norm would be in that situation. So, for example, OCD would be abnormal under this definition because they may switch off a light 5 times, whereas the social norm would be to switch it off once and then leave the room. So you're naming a disorder, you're saying it's abnormal, you're saying what behaviour they would perform, and you're giving the equivalent social norm. So what I would like you to do for me now, please, is I'd like you to look at these examples, and I want you to pick 2 of them. I want you to write them into your booklet on the bottom of page 4, but I want you to use the format of my OCD example. Now, if you want to use that OCD example that's already there for you, fine, but you need one other to add into your booklet. So pause me, please, now, and everybody do that for me. Okay. Once you've done that, you should now have this sheet in front of you, the A3 summary, and you'll see that exam technique that I've already mentioned: name, outline, elaborate, apply. So I would like you to fill in the first row, so definition number 1, using the information that you've just gathered. If you can be brave, close your booklet up and see how you get on with it. If not, and that's a bit too fast, then do it with your notes in front of you, but make sure you're breaking it down into those 4 little sections. So again, everybody pause me now and fill in that summary sheet. They will be checked by your teachers on the first lesson back, so it's important that everybody engages with this. Okay, so now then we've outlined one definition of abnormality, and before we go on to the evaluation, I'm going to tell you there's going to be some generic evaluation points that are going to keep cropping up. Now, these generic evaluation points are really, really easy to learn. If you get stuck when you are being asked to evaluate one of these definitions, these general ideas will serve you well in that exam. What it means is that you don't necessarily have to rote learn the evaluation points in your booklet. As long as you've got an understanding of some of these concepts, you could kind of like fill in the blanks a little bit. Now, obviously, I'm not telling you not to learn the evaluation points in your booklet, but you'll see when we move through it, there are some common patterns. So a number of these points are terms and phrases that you're already familiar with and that you've already covered. All you've got to be able to do is learn the examples to illustrate it. So when evaluating definitions of abnormality, there are several general ideas that you can learn if you get stuck. So first one, we can argue that some of the definitions are culturally relative. So what that means is that it is trying to use one culture's definition of normal and abnormal behaviour to explain abnormality across all cultures. And as we already know from your work on attachment styles, culture is not fixed, and therefore, like attachment style, abnormality also varies globally. A second key evaluation idea is that the behaviour that is being described might not necessarily be a defining feature. So any definition which is using this evaluation point is assuming that possession of a particular trait makes someone abnormal, which might not always be the case. It might not always be the case that you can use that specific behaviour to categorise the normal from the abnormal. There might be a little bit of overlap. Next, another phrase that you hopefully should be familiar with. The definition is era dependent. If it's era dependent, then that means its ideas are pretty much outdated, and it's trying to define abnormal behaviour using ideas that have passed, all right, that are no longer applicable in our society. Furthermore, some of the definitions are context dependent, i.e. abnormal behaviours are dependent on the situation. And this definition, or these definitions whereby we're using this evaluation point, often fail to account for individuality. And then the final one, again, it's quite common, is this one. The definitions, or at least some of them, are based on what we call subjective judgments. They all assume that it's very easy to draw the line between normality and abnormality, and that is simply not the case. Abnormality, in most cases, is in the eye of whomever is viewing it. So it's definitely down to whether or not you think the behaviour is abnormal. Now, I've not given you these evaluation points on a sheet because if you are going to try and use them, then it would be a good idea to just make a note of them somewhere. Anywhere where you've got a blank space in your booklet or anywhere in your own revision notes, might be a good idea to jot these down because they will keep cropping up. If you want to do that, pause this now. If not, then we're going to move straight into the evaluation of deviation from social norms. Okay then, so deviation from social norms, you will notice hopefully straight away there are no strengths, okay? So we're going to move our way through and complete pages 6 and 7. So this deviation or this definition is accused of being culturally relative. This is because social norms are not universal and vary across the world. So you might be thinking, why has Fiona decided to put that random picture in here? I've put it in there because that is an example of why deviation from social norms is culturally relative. Social norms are not universal, they vary globally, okay? Dependent on where you are in the world, that behaviour there demonstrated by those women may be classed as abnormal. So for example, if we as females in our society decided to walk around topless, that is breaking social norms. In their culture, it's entirely normal, okay? So this idea is that this definition does not explain abnormality around the world. It is culturally relative. Social norms are not universal and vary across the world. This means that this definition ignores cultural differences in abnormality. Now remember, some of you won't necessarily need to write down those conclusions. If you're not aiming for a C or above, then you really don't need to be concerning yourself with those conclusions. If, however, you're aiming for C pluses, then you need to get those popped down into your booklets. Furthermore, you'll see that for every single weakness, I give an example to illustrate the point. If you do not use those examples later on in the exam questions, then you will drop marks. The examiner is looking for you to show your knowledge, so you've got to have those examples there to illustrate. So that's the first criticism, that it's culturally relative. Moving on to the second criticism, this definition is also era dependent. So we said this is to do with the time frame that it was put forward. So this is because this definition, deviation from social norm, does not account for the fact that social norms change over time. And again, notice I've built in an example. So homosexuality was once considered a mental illness. So did you know that up until the 1970s, if you were openly gay, you were classed as having a mental illness? In fact, up until the 1950s, you could have been institutionalised if you were shown to be a homosexual. So social norms change over time. Think how many gay individuals you do know at this stage, okay? Social norms have changed over time. Homosexuality is no longer abnormal. It is widely accepted as being a normal behaviour. So this definition, therefore, only applies to one period of time. You cannot take social norms from one era and use them to explain all behaviour right now. So that's the second definition, okay? Not only is it culturally relative, it is era dependent. And finally, all right, the last criticism that you'll see listed in your booklet is that social norms are context dependent. So this is because many behaviours that deviate from social norms are simply classed as eccentric. If you saw them, it's not abnormal in a psychiatric sense, i.e. you don't think that somebody's mentally ill because they are a little bit eccentric. Example to illustrate that point is extensive tattooing or face modification. So we've all seen examples like this. I know that many of you, all right, as our students have got tattoos. If you consider somebody like Ed Sheeran, who's recently gone out and tattooed virtually his entire body, is that abnormal or is that just a personality trait? Is it just eccentric? So it definitely goes against the social norm. We can't understand why somebody would want to do that to their body, but it's not abnormal. You're not suffering from a mental illness. You're not psychiatrically ill. So this means that this definition ignores individuality. And what it does is that it wrongly labels anybody who is eccentric as being abnormal, when they're not, all right? They are not abnormal in the psychiatric sense. They are just in possession of some quirky personality traits. So that then concludes our first definition of abnormality. So what do you need to do next? First things first, I would strongly recommend that you complete the essay plan on deviation from social norms. You have already been told by your subject teachers that your next assessment in psychology is going to be a 12-mark essay on one or more of the definitions of abnormality. Now, the essay plans that I've given you are only for 8 marks. That's because in those essay plans there's only one definition being discussed. If it was a 12-mark question, we would expect 2 or more definitions, so that's what you're going to get on your assessment. Remember that you should only complete the sections relevant for your target minimum grade. So D and E grades only really need 1 strength and 1 weakness, and you don't really need the conclusions. If you're aiming for higher than that, obviously you need to build up your essay. You can also complete the quizzes. Now it says that the definition is going to come up as a little hyperlinked. Unfortunately, I couldn't get it to embed in, so I've put the link to that quizzes underneath this video on Moodle. It's like Kahoot, but you can basically do it on your own without us doing it in the classroom. So if you want to have a blast at that, it's a different way to check your knowledge. Okay, so pause this video now then before we move on to the second one, and make sure you've done some consolidation before you go on to failure to function. Okay then, so welcome back. Hopefully you've took a little rest break, or you've had at least some chance to consolidate your knowledge. Now then, moving on to pages 7 and 8 in your booklet, which is definition number 2. Now that we've done 1, it should hopefully make it a little bit easier, a little bit quicker to move through them, because you know the exam structures, you know what's being expected. So on to the second definition then. You know that the first thing you've got to do is name it. So to name this definition, it is failure to function adequately. All right, again, you've got to say it word for word. So you're not allowed to say not functioning normally. It's got to be failure to function adequately. Section number 2, say how this definition categorises abnormal behaviour. So according to this definition, behaviour is abnormal if it prevents a person from coping with everyday activities. So that's the failure to function bit. So you're abnormal if if the illness that you are suffering from is preventing you from coping with everyday activities. Moving into section number 3, this is where we start to elaborate it using terminology. Now, in this particular definition, we've got 2 researchers. So we've got Rosenhan and Seligman. Now, Rosenhan and Seligman argue that behaviour is abnormal if it meets specific criteria. And they name those criteria as maladaptive, irrational, causing observer discomfort, and if it's unpredictable. Also, it might be classed as abnormal if it causes some sort of personal suffering. Now, you'll see at the bottom of your page, okay, that you have got little definitions of each of those. What it means to be maladaptive, what it means to be irrational, what it means to cause observer discomfort, and what it means to be unpredictable. But what we need to add in here is some examples. So you can jot these onto your little table at the bottom of the page. So maladaptive behaviour is something that is kind of like preventing you from achieving your life goals. In this case, any behaviour that might be preventing you from working or holding down a relationship or being able to go outside and socialise is basically any behaviour that is causing you to not achieve normal life goals, which we all take for granted. Irrational behaviour is simply behaviour that people around you can't make sense of. They don't understand why you're doing that. So for example, sometimes behaviour doesn't make sense. We can't understand it. Somebody who is depressed might just burst into tears and we've got no idea why they are crying, okay? It's totally irrational to us. You might just be sat having a conversation and there we go with the tears. Observer discomfort is any behaviour that others find either upsetting, threatening, makes them feel a bit uncomfortable or embarrassed, they're not sure how to respond to you. And then unpredictable behaviour is behaviour that is totally out of the blue. Now that and irrational behaviour is totally different. Irrational behaviour is where you can't explain it. Unpredictable behaviour is where you're not expecting it, okay? So pop those in, please, before you move on to the next page. Hopefully you've realised using this structure that the next section is to apply it, all right? So get your examples popped in and then we'll move on to the next little phase. So how do we apply those 4 characteristics to a disorder? Easiest disorder to apply these characteristics to is depression. So I've already given you some examples here. I've named each of the 4 criteria proposed by Rosenhan and Seligman, and I've said why in a depressed person they are not functioning. So for example, how you would say it in the exam, depression causes failure to function adequately because people show maladaptive behaviour. So I've named it and then I've said, for example, they may find it difficult to go to work or form relationships. Now depression is really easy, as I've said, to illustrate it, but if you don't want to use depression, if you don't want to put that into your booklet, you can use another example if you like. So these are the other examples that you can use. So OCD might cause some observer discomfort. Depression might cause some observer discomfort as well. Self-loathing, suicidal tendencies that kind of catch people off guard and you're not sure how to respond. And then phobias might also cause observer discomfort. Panic attacks, fainting, etc, etc. So like I said, if you want to use depression, it's nice and easy because you can go with any of those behaviours and say how they would apply to depression, or you can use the ones that we've just been through, okay? However, I do want you to use this here, okay? I want you to use that structure. So now again, pop some examples. I would go with 2. Pop 2 examples into your booklet now on the application section before moving on to the evaluation. Okay, so now you've got that filled in. Pause for a second, fill in this big A3 summary sheet. Again, following that structure, name it, outline it, elaborate it, and apply it. Pause me here, and then we're going to move straight into the evaluation content. Okay, so on the previous definition, so deviation from social norms, I gave you a pack of 5 evaluation points which you're going to keep coming across. Now, I'm just wondering if you can spot already which of these would be appropriate for failure to function. So it's using these 4 criteria to try and say why or how someone is abnormal, all right? And it's saying that maladaptiveness, observed discomfort, irrational and unpredictable behaviour are always signs of abnormal behaviour. So if you look at these, all right, I would say the most obvious one to go for is this. Because what one person views as being maladaptive, another person might not see it as being maladaptive. So if you want to stay in your pajamas for a couple of days, one person might see that as signs of, I don't know, clinical depression. Another person might just see that as you're chilling out for a couple of days. It's totally based on subjective judgments, and there's no real line between normal and abnormal. So that was just to get you kind of thinking. You've now got the evaluation points filled in your booklet. All we've got to do is pop some words in. So one criticism of this definition is that failing to function adequately is based on subjective judgments, as I've just said. This is because what is classed as failure to function may depend on personal opinion. So we've got an example for you here, which is Tourette's syndrome. So for example, people with Tourette's syndrome suffer from what we call tics. Now these would cause observer discomfort in some people, whereas others wouldn't be offended in the slightest, okay? They might even be amused, all right? So tics can take all shapes and forms, but probably the most common tic that you know is swearing, okay? It's not necessarily always swearing, but that's the kind of behaviour that you lot will probably be familiar with. So for one person, it might be totally abnormal, okay? Sign of a mental illness. For other people, it does not cause us any offence. So therefore, using that definition or using that characteristic of observer discomfort to define someone as being abnormal, it doesn't work. It's entirely subjective. So this means the definition is unreliable. If you think what reliability means, it's about repetition, it's about people saying the same thing. If it's open to subjective judgments, then it's totally unreliable. What one person says is going to be different to what the next person says. So what is abnormal depends on who is making the judgment. Moving on to the second evaluation point, so completing pages 8 and 9. Failure to function is also culturally relative. This is because what is classed as failing to function varies across the world. For example, in Western culture, hallucinations are a sign of failure to function because they are seen as a sign of what we call psychotic behaviour. Whereas in some non-Western cultures, hallucinating is actually seen as some sort of spiritual experience. And if you hallucinate, you may even be worshipped, okay? So that is a sign of functioning more than adequately. So this means that this definition ignores cultural differences and values, okay? So the first definition, deviation from social norms, was culturally relative. This is as well. Remember what I said from the first one, you've got to get your examples in there. Without it, there's not a great deal to say. Moving on then to the final criticism here. We've got failure to function is not a defining feature of abnormality. This is because it is possible to be abnormal and yet still function. Now, the examples that we use here are serial killers. So, for example, Harold Shipman killed over 200 of his patients. He was a GP. He was actually registered in Pontefract, for those of you who did not know that, and over the span of several years killed 200 of his patients whilst at the same time being a community GP. Similarly, we've got Ted Bundy, who also killed 36 women whilst at the same time as maintaining a long-term relationship, and she was none the wiser, and completing a law degree. So these two people, clearly abnormal because they can murder on such a wide scale, but they're not failing to function, they're not maladaptive, they're not kind of like failing to go to work, they're living normal lives, they're not making anybody feel uncomfortable, they're not being unpredictable or irrational, they are functioning perfectly normal. So this means this definition does not define all cases of abnormality. So now then, we've got the evaluation done for that particular definition. Now, what you'll see here is that I'm not advising you to go and fill in your essay plan. Of course you can do that, but we've got a little bit of exam practice that we can complete instead. So turn to page 22 and we're going to have a look at question 11A. So, when walking to work, Liam has to touch and count every lamppost that he passes or he becomes very worried. This sometimes makes him late for work. This behaviour is an example of deviation from social norms. Identify one other definition of abnormality and explain why Liam's behaviour could be considered abnormal according to this definition. So it's for 4 marks. Question is for 4 marks. It follows the exact same structure that I've already given you. The only difference is that when you come to apply it, you've got to use Liam as your example. Answer this question now, please, using the 4-part structure I have provided you with. Remember, it says it has to be a definition other than deviation from social norms. Pause this now, please. Your teacher will be checking this answer in the first lesson back. Okay, so hopefully you've just answered that question. I'm just going to now give you a sample answer. So, Liam is abnormal using failure to function adequately. This definition states that behaviour is abnormal if it prevents us from coping with everyday activities and if it meets 4 criteria, being maladaptive, irrational, unpredictable or causing observer discomfort. So up to there, I've got 2 marks. In this case, Liam's behaviour is irrational. There is no reason why he has to touch and count the lamppost and we can't explain it. Also, his behaviour is unpredictable. We don't expect to see people touching lampposts walking down the street. So I've named it, I've outlined the definition, I've elaborated it and I've applied it, okay? So your answer should include all of those things, all right? So give yourself a mark out of 4 now and your teacher will check that. Final little bit of exam practice that we can have a look at is this, which is on page 16. Now, these are examples of answers that we have previously seen from our students. The question says, explain one limitation of the failure to function adequately definition of abnormality. Now, this first example here only gets 1 out of 2. They're absolutely right in what they're saying. They're talking about cultural relativism, but there are no examples to elaborate the limitation, so it shows very little understanding. The second answer that's in your booklet says a limitation of the failure to function adequately definition is that not all of the ideal mental health characteristics are important in all cultures. Now that should be an immediate flag. That should get 0 out of 2 because they've talked about the wrong definition. So what I would like you to do now, please, you've got space in your booklet to answer that question. Okay, so do that now. You can either flip back or you can have a go at doing it yourself. It should be pretty easy. And again, if you want to just check it against my answer here, one limitation is that the definition is culturally relative. For example, in Western culture, hallucinations are a sign of psychosis, whereas in non-Western cultures, they are seen as a spiritual experience. So I've given the example there to illustrate my point. If you're aiming for an A or a B, always make reference to the conclusion. This means that this definition does not take into account cultural differences in abnormality. You'll see there is one final question in your booklets on page 19. There is no sample answer for this one. I would like you to answer this question now on your own. It would be more beneficial if you do that without looking back at your notes. Outline for 3 marks because they've already named the definition for you. Evaluate for 3 marks, so do 1 strength and 1 weakness, but keep them very, very brief. Off you go, guys. That then brings us to the end of this particular definition. What I would advise you to do is take a break, all right? Maybe even come back to this tomorrow. We've done 2 at the moment. We've got 2 left to go. You've got your essay plans to fill in. You've got your summary sheets to have a go at as well. Please do not do any more straight away, okay? Take some time to let it consolidate.